Hey, this is Torrin Walker. If you like Context Media Group, help us to keep telling stories. Hey, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Wednesday Wisdom. This is Torrin Walker, and today I'm going to be speaking with a gentleman. He calls himself a justice journalist. He's a sports writer for Deadspin, formerly was with New York Daily News, and he also has a second career documenting protests. He was in Ferguson, and he's also documenting the protests in Washington, D.C. This is Chuck Modi. Chuck, how are you doing?
I'm doing great, Torrin. Great to see you. Last time I saw you, we were in Ferguson.
Yeah, man, in the middle of all that heat and all those bugs and everything,
Yeah.
but we got some really good conversations with people who are on the ground.
Right.
Cool.
Appreciate you.
Yeah, no, my pleasure, man. Appreciate you. Let's just get started, man. Let's talk about how you got into documenting protests. What sparked that in you?
I think I started post Trayvon. When Trayvon was killed, there were some protests in D.C., and I just started bringing a camera around. And this is before the cell phones were really that good. So it's 2012, right? There were protests 2012 and then 2013 after the verdict. And I just started walking up to people and asking them, hey, why did you come out? Very simple stuff. Why did you come out? And I wanted to know the answers. And really, since that time, that's my go-to question. Went to Ferguson afterwards, and like many people who went to Ferguson for a couple of days, planned to go for a couple of days, we got sucked in. We saw the level of brutality inflicted by the Ferguson Police Department, and we ended up staying there for months. And I think ever since then, I've been wed to trying to amplify and capture the voice of protesters who are often demeaned, made to look stupid and more violent and dumber in the mainstream media than they actually are. And I want to honor their intellect and their voice.
Okay, what you're doing is in a long tradition of independent and citizen journalism. For people who may not be familiar, can you give a little background about what citizen journalism is?
Sure. It's interesting. I say the word citizen journalism, and then everybody says, well, everyone's a citizen. But often when we work for a corporation, we don't get to tell the story. We have editors that make us tell the story. I would say, and I often use the word justice journalist and movement journalist, I try to have journalism in the tradition of an Ida B. Wells, for me, is the greatest investigative journalist of all time. Ida B. Wells covered lynchings when no one else would. Ida B. Wells never thought at any point in time that there were two sides to lynching, that I need to go interview the lynchers and hear their side of the story. Ida B. Wells didn't think. Ida B. Wells knew lynching was wrong and said, you know what? I'm going to document why it's wrong. And that comes in the tradition of the black press, whether it was Frederick Douglass and slavery and many others who said slavery was wrong and we're going to use our media to show it. And when we talk about lynching today, my view is there's not two sides to police lynching. That if there's an officer who gets away with murder and we all see it's murder on video, there's really nothing to discuss. At the very minimum, that officer needs to be in jail, and you are 100% wrong based on human rights. So it comes away and it departs maybe from the journalism that is often taught in school that privileges power and privilege as objective, when it's the farthest thing from being objective. There's no such thing as objective journalism. So I'm very open and very honest in that journalism, in the tradition of the black press, and then also the independent press going back hundreds of years.
Okay, what does independent journalism do, or what is it able to do that mainstream journalism can or won't do?
Tell the truth, period. Tell the truth. If I work for a paper, and I have worked for mainstream papers, for instance, it's a common practice in policing when someone is killed is to get the police statement. It's a matter of actual journalistic practice. You have to go and get the police statement. Well, what if we know through objective investigation that most police statements are lies? We know this, that we are asking professionally trained liars what their opinion is. As a journalist, do I not have a responsibility to factor in what we know about police policing. If I have Kellyanne Conway on my show and I know ahead of time Kellyanne Conway is going to spew a bunch of lies, well, maybe I shouldn't have Kellyanne Conway on my show. Maybe the person who booked Kellyanne Conway made the mistake. And I feel there's no reason to get a police statement. It doesn't mean I haven't included quotes from police in pieces, but it means I know they're professional liars. And I know if I interviewed 100 police officers, they would all toe the party line of what the officer said. But if I interview 10 protesters, I can really get the truth. Even if those protesters have inconsistencies within them, that could come out. So I am trying to understand the truth, where today's journalism privileges people in position of authority and says they're the experts. The military general that we invite after we drop a bomb is an expert. The police chief after a murder is killed, someone is killed, is the expert. And we reject that philosophy. We say the expert is the person experiencing the bomb, is experiencing racism, or is experiencing sexism, that the recipient of oppression is the best expert to talk about that very oppression. We center that voice, not the person who is inflicting oppression.
Okay. As I said before, you're known for interviewing people who are involved in street actions or involved in protests. Why is it so important to hear their perspective?
Because one, we want to get at the truth. That's number one. And two, in our current media construct, their voices are being shut out. Their voices might be shut out to racism. Their voices may be shut out to classism, be shut out to sexism. We're not hearing their voices. You also have to have a certain level of respectability to get on the news. You have to filter your way in a way that is palatable for the news and often larger white audiences. And that is not often what you hear on the street. So there's often a very different conversation on the street. I'd also say this. I'm fascinated with, and I think we all should be fascinated with, what makes someone go to the street? There are millions of people who believe, say, police terror is wrong, believe racism is wrong, believe sexism is wrong, believe homophobia is wrong. There are millions of people who believe that. But what happens? Why does one person leave the couch to the street and another person stay on the couch? Well, everyone who leaves the couch to a street has a story to tell. And I believe it is our obligation to tell their story, to amplify their story. Why did you leave your couch to come here? And the more of those stories we can tell, the more truth we can tell, and the more oppression we can discover that is not being covered.
All right. You're also a sports journalist. Do you find a lot of similarities between the energy of covering sports, or the energy around sports, and the energy around street action and protest? And do you think those two need to be separated, or where do you see their similarities, or do they need to be separated?
No, I mean, we have to tell it through sports. And obviously, the likes of Colin Kaepernick have made that so easy for us. It has converged it on a national stage. But the truth is, often when you're doing this type of journalism, we're talking to ourselves. We're talking to other people who agree. And what someone like Colin Kaepernick has done, and Eric Reed has done, and so many other players have done, Maya Moore has done, Megan Rapinoe has done, is taking that conversation into the masses who don't want to hear it. That's what Colin Kaepernick's crime was. He was making white people uncomfortable through an absolute peaceful protest. And when you ignored the peaceful protest of Colin Kaepernick, you cannot complain where you have less than peaceful protests, because you didn't listen when it was peaceful. You blackballed him when it was peaceful. And you ostracized him and took $100 million away from him. So Kaepernick allows us to take that conversation into new popular spaces. So I honor Kaepernick and all the other names that I just mentioned, but I always want to be clear about this. As much as I love Kaepernick and what he's doing, Kaepernick came after the protesters in Ferguson. Kaepernick came after the protesters in Baltimore. Kaepernick came after the protesters in Standing Rock. And that the people ultimately have the power and inspire the great Colin Kaepernicks and others to talk about justice. If that didn't happen, Kaepernick would not have realized his incredible voice and taken his incredible risks.
Okay. We've seen through protests and how protests have been framed and how those have been shaped, we've seen the power that one person with a smartphone can do to change a narrative. During this pandemic, we've seen major news networks learning how to do more with less because they can't get to their studios. do you think there's a future for the tactics of independent and citizen journalism to move into the mainstream, or do you think they might be co-opted by the mainstream?
It's a great question, and I straddle this line all the time and have one foot in mainstream. And I have to tell you, most of the work I do is just on my own time. I'm not paid for it. I just do it on my own time, and because I feel it's important. Here's what you do. I don't begrudge writers who work in the mainstream, because we have to invade those spaces. Whether they have a big platform, you have to invade those spaces. So I'm not anti-mainstream writer. Here's what I am. You have to do it on your own terms. And that's where it's difficult. You usually have to be lucky to have, I have a great editor when I do sports writing, a wonderful editor who's behind me. I've had written pieces where I had other people like, your editor let you write that? And yeah, they did. They didn't take that out. So you hear stories in the mainstream of how their great work was changed by the editors for different reasons. So if you have a space in mainstream that will allow you to do the work on your terms, and I don't mean editing, we all get edited. We all get that. I'm not talking about cosmetic. I'm talking about fundamentally changing the thesis of your story because it might be too hard on police. That's what I'm talking about here. We need people in those spaces. So when Wesley Lowery wrote for the Washington Post, I thought that was very important. When Wesley Lowery left the Washington Post, so did a lot of the Washington Post good coverage. So who has done, and they have done terrible coverage of the more recent post-George Floyd protests in Washington, D.C. in their backyard. So I welcome people invading those spaces on their own terms. Now, if you're asking me, would I work for a mainstream publication that changed the terms of engagement? Now that I got to work on their terms, that I have to be somewhat of a pro-police outfit. No, I would never do that. So there's a collaboration. They may be collaborating for a different reason. They may be collaborating for reasons of profit. I may be collaborating to get the word out. We may come from different points of view. And if there's a marriage, that could work. But ultimately, it's very problematic in a corporate media landscape that is 90% consumed. 90% of media that is consumed is corporate media.
All right. It seems like the public is beginning to lose trust in mainstream media to give them news that isn't slanted. We're also seeing the emergence of alternative networks coalescing around citizen and independent journalism. Do you think that alternative and independent news orgs could eventually pose a challenge to mainstream narratives?
I would love it. I mean, that's what I mentioned about invading spaces. I don't begrudge anyone. I understand it. But if you're asking me what is the best way, if we want to be smart and we want to build an activist community, we have to build our own networks, like what you're trying to do in context media, what many people are trying to do. The problem is that the corporate media have tanks and bombs and billion-dollar budgets, and we're throwing rocks and stones, and we have water pistols with Patreon accounts. I don't care how brilliant you are, the scale is not there. So what happens is those who are telling truth from a left perspective, and I don't even like saying left perspective because truth is truth, from an anti-oppression perspective, really, is what we're talking about, who will challenge a military-industrial complex when no one in mainstream media can because their bosses won't let them. When we want to do that, we need other outlets to do that. We need outlets that aren't tied to those industries. And unfortunately, the challenge is building that to scale. And I don't have the answer for that. I don't think a bunch of Patreon accounts and a bunch of one-person, two-person operations is the answer. I don't have the answer, but I know we need to build it.
Okay. What are your predictions for the future of independent and citizen journalism?
I don't have a good feeling about it. I don't have a good feeling. We know local newspapers are dying every day. And the real journalism is local journalism. We know Sinclair can push a button and have the same message, pro-police, pro-military, pro-right-wing message go out to millions of local avenues. So, I mean, you know, a lot of this roots back to the 1996 Telecommunications Act, which consolidated all of corporate media, killed black-owned radio, by the way, overnight, and so many other independent outfits because there was a ceiling that you could not own more than 40 stations. So we need to re-implement that. I think the only person talking about that on a level in the last election, on a grand level, was Bernie Sanders. to some degree. I don't know how you roll that back because those are empires we're talking about. So right now, I don't have great faith in the future of media. I'm kind of frightened about it, to be quite honest with you, because of the sheer scale of dollars that they have. All I know is that we have to try. All I know is that we have to stay out there and keep telling the truth, and use social media. And even sometimes social media works against what we're trying to do. So it's very difficult.
All right. Chuck Modi, justice journalist, thank you for your time.
Hey, appreciate it. Thank you so much. Keep doing what you're doing.
No, you as well, brother.